Lifelong Learning, A Taste of Pillar 2 are short presentations taught by Pillar instructors in partnership with the Pikes Peak Library District. This program is made possible as the result of a grant from Next 50 Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding innovative, mission-driven initiatives that improve the lives of older adults and their caregivers.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you will enjoy seeing and participating in today's PowerPoint presentation. Then came the Conquistadors, which will cover the explorers of the Americas. So we're going to be talking mostly about the Age of Discovery, which different historians have demarcated as taking place between 1400 and 1600 AD. And we'll be focusing mostly on Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish explorers because they're the ones who really opened up the Americas. And most of it is actually concerning South America and Central America rather than what is currently the United States or North America. The Portuguese were particularly important in the earliest part of this Age of Discovery, and they really led the way under the sponsorship of Prince Henry of Portugal, known as Henry the Navigator. And then we had Spain, which was competing with Portugal at the time, and their explorations took place between 1419 and 1507. They went out to the Indian Ocean in later 1400s, 1497 to 1513, really plied the Pacific Ocean quite a bit because they were looking for trade routes to India and the Orient, and spice trade with China, etc. Then we'll also talk about the inland explorations of South America, particularly Mexico and Central America, by the Conquistadors. And they opened up new trade routes between 1542 and 1565. One comment before we get into the specific ones, specific explorers. One said, I'm going to be labeling the Conquistadors. By today's standards, were politically incorrect. They were hailed at the time as great explorers, et cetera, but they were particularly brutal in suppressing the native population, the native tribes of both Mexico and Central and South America. Today we have the controversy, for instance, of taking down statues of Christopher Columbus because of the way he treated and led to the decimation of American Indian tribes. In a way, it's a little bit unfair to judge them by today's standards, because by their standards, the Europeans felt they had all the right to do what they did. It was blessed by the Pope, among other things, as we'll see. So, pre-Columbus, before Columbus opened up, quote, the New World to European settlers and European explorers. And incidentally, we often refer, or historians often refer to Christopher Columbus discovering the New World or the Americas. He was hardly the first person to discover. The Vikings beat him by at least 500 years. And there's a lot of speculation with some good data behind it that the Chinese may have explored along North America prior to Christopher Columbus. And of course, Native Americans were there long before the Europeans came. So rather than saying discovered America or the Americas, we should say all of these explorers that I'll be talking about today were discoverers for Europeans, particularly Western Europeans. They didn't know the New World was there. So they were, discovering it for the first time rather than humans discovering this new continent. And previous to Christopher Columbus, the native tribes, it's a collection of them, are known as the Taino population. And they settled what becomes the opening for the Europeans, what today we would call Haiti. And Haiti in Taino language simply means high ground. And the Spanish called it Hispaniola. So I said it was blessed by the Pope. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI divided the world, or the New World, because there was a conflict between the Portuguese and the Spanish, who at that time had the best fleets of ships to sail around the world, to sail broadly, over who had a right to the lands that they were discovering, that they were opening up. And so the Pope drew an imaginary line through the mid-Atlantic that would be 100 leagues from Cape Verde Islands, which they knew they were closer to Europe. And then Spain was entitled to all lands west of that line, Portugal to all lands east of that imaginary line. It didn't last very long. Within a year, they renegotiated the lines because they were basically finding, hey, there's a lot more to this in terms of the territory. And only native tribes were there. So these lands were considered from a European ethnocentric viewpoint as undeveloped or unpopulated. They didn't recognize the native population as having rights to that land. They just say they were open for, as long as Europeans weren't there, they were open for conquest. So anyway, in 1494, they renegotiated that line to 370 leagues west of Cape Verde Islands. So the ones I'm going to be talking about, the principal explorers during this period of the Age of Discovery, and then the conquistadors, who are less discoverers and more conquerors. Conquistador means conquer in Spanish. The ones I'll be talking about then are Bartolomeo Diaz, John Cabot, which is the English version of Giovanni Cabot, Italian. He's really an Italian explorer, but because he was under the authority or aegis of the British Crown, they anglicized his name to John Cabot, and that's what he's known among us today as John Cabot. But it was really Giovanni Cabot. Vasco de Gama, Amerigo Vespucci, and these first four are really explorers in the real sense of the word. Amerigo Vespucci, we'll see in a minute, is most important for his cartography, his drawing the maps of the New World, which prior to that time really hadn't been mapped, at least by Western Europeans. And then we get into a series of explorers / conquerors, and those are Hernan Cortez, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Hernando de Soto, Francisco Pizarro, and Juan de Garay. And I'll talk about each of those in subsequent slides here. So Diaz, he usually goes by Bartolomeo. He was a navigator, Portuguese navigator, and an explorer. And he's the first European to sail around the southernmost tip of Africa to find a way to the east. He died in 1500 at the Cape of Good Hope. And so they had to sail all the way around. Well, he was the first one to do it. So John Cabot, Giovanni Cabot. As I mentioned, he's an Italian navigator, and an explorer. And in 1497, he discovered parts of North America. He was the first European in the continent of North America since the Norse Vikings in the 11th century, about 1000, 1001, 1003, is when the Vikings landed in what was today called Newfoundland. And Cabot was born in Genoa, in Gaeta, Italy, but why he's got the English name is his explorations were financed by the British, by England. So he was the first to search for the Northwest Passage. Europeans, Northwestern Europeans particularly, wanted to get a trade route from Europe to the Pacific, to India, where the spice trade, et cetera, for the great value at the time there. And they wanted a shorter route. And so they thought if they could find this Northwest Passage, they would be able to sail through it going west to get to the east. And he made Cabot made three voyages, 1496, 1497, 1498, with a fleet of 5 ships sailing out of Bristol. So this is a picture of a painting and Cabot, or Cabot, in his Venetian garb, very fanciful. He didn't walk around like that day to day. And I've seen this actually, this particular Cabot Tower is in St. John's, Newfoundland. On one of my cruises, I stopped at St. John's, and this is probably the major tourist attraction site on St. John's, Newfoundland. Okay, so our next explorer is Vasco de Gama, who lived, I think, from about 1460 to 1524. He is also a Portuguese count, explorer, and he commanded the first ships to sail directly from Europe to India. And he was named by the Portuguese the governor of Portuguese India. And the official title that they used back then is called Viceroy. So he was the Viceroy of India. He was also known, as they like to get the fancy titles, he was also known as Admiral of the Seas of Arabia, Persia, India, and all the Orient. His first voyage was in 1497. He left with a fleet of 4 ships from Lisbon, and they would sail as they did all that time, because they hadn't yet discovered another route, around Africa to India in 1499. So it took them basically 2 years to get that. His second voyage was titled the India Armada, and it left Lisbon in 1500. They bombarded Calcutta, which today we would call Calcutta, and they returned to Lisbon in 1503. So notice it's taking 2 to 3 years for the round trip of going from Lisbon to India, back to Lisbon again. De Gama was by far the financially most successful of all the Portuguese explorers during the Age of Discovery. He became an extremely wealthy man because he opened up the spice trade. Instead of having to wait and bring things along an overland route, which took really long time, they could do it by ship, which was at that time, even though it's slow by today's comparison, back then it was faster and certainly much less costly than the overland route of trade. In his third voyage was in 1524. He then left with a fleet of 14 ships, because by then he was really wealthy enough and successful enough to mount ever larger expeditions, if you will, in terms of the number of ships. And he arrived in September of 1524. Notice it's a little faster time because by now they know the routes and how to sail, etc. And the ships were getting better in terms of the sailing ships. But he died of malaria in Cochin, India, in 1524. So this is some views of a depiction, a painting, early depiction of Vasco da Gama. Notice that heroic pose. Some of you may remember a similar picture of painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River, where he's standing up in the front of the bow of the boat, etc. He didn't really do that. That's just, to feature him in the painting. And this lower image of him showing a really portly fellow, which you see also in the statue, that's really what he looked like for most of his career. He was wealthy enough, he could eat extremely well. And in those days, the wealth was in part, today we, somebody that looks like Vasco da Gama's statue, we would say, oh, he's fat and not very ugly or not very handsome. In those days, that was a sign of your wealth. And people admired somebody who was really fat. Think of Henry VIII of England and how portly he is. And this is a cross called the De Gama cross, which was a memorial to him. And the statue nearby the church honors him also as a memorial. He was really very successful. Of all the ones we're going to talk about, he was the most successful of the explorers. So Amerigo Vespucci lived from 1454 to 1512. He was an Italian explorer, a financier. He was a navigator, and most importantly, a cartographer. He drew maps. The Americas derived their name from his feminized Latin version of his first name, Amerigo. When you put it in Latin and it takes the feminine form, A instead of O, it comes America. He was born and raised in Florence, Italy, and he was a Florentine merchant, and the Florentine merchants were arguably the most successful merchants at that time. They were extremely wealthy, all with sea trade, ocean trade. And he's important for demonstrating that the New World was not Asia, but a previously unknown fourth continent, unknown to the Europeans as a fourth continent. And he explored and mapped South America in a series of voyages, 1497 to 1504, 1497-98, 1499 to 1500, 1501, 1502, and 1503-1504. So those four major voyages is where he sailed and drew maps, mostly from the coastline. Some of the land exploration maps are not very accurate by today's standards, but they were much more accurate than any maps produced by Europeans prior to that time. So his major contributions, he mapped the Alpha and Beta Centauri constellation, the constellation Crux, or the Southern Cross in the sky. That was known to the Greeks. So he wasn't really the first one to do it. He was the first Western European to map that constellation, because it was forgotten by Europeans because it was below the European horizon. So when he sailed far enough east, he could then get to where he could map it. He also wrote an enormously important book called Mundus Novus, New World, and that's what really, ever since that time, they refer to all the Americas as the New World, new to the Europeans again. So this book was basically his accounts of his voyages, and it had a great impact on Europe. In 1508, King Ferdinand appointed him as the chief navigator of Spain. So even though he's Italian, because he was a good navigator, the Spanish titled him sponsored him. This is a statue of Vespucci, very in the Roman Italian style. He didn't walk around dressed like that, maybe look like that. It's imitating the classic Roman marble statues of heroic figures. But he certainly was. He was very lionized at the time. He was considered one of the great explorers of that age of discovery. So we'll now talk about three explorers from Spain who are best known as conquistadors. So they did some exploring, particularly inland. Most of the previous explorers we've talked about were doing it from ship, and they stayed on their ship quite a bit of the time and drew their maps and everything from the coastline as they were going. They did not explore on land that much. These guys, these explorers or conquistadors, were in search of gold, riches, and they got on land and they conquered, hence the name conquistador. They conquered the South American and Central American region and the tribes that occupied those lands. They were all searching for gold, and they made what became known as the Spanish Main, the gold trade. So we're going to talk about three of them: Hernan Cortez, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, and Francisco Pizarro. All three of them were, by today's standards, brutal conquerors. So Hernan or Hernando or Fernando, all three names have been used to us. He was born in Medellin, Spain, not a particularly wealthy or prominent part of Spain, incidentally, but a number of the explorers and persons who went to the New World came from Medellin. So he departed for the New World in 1504. So the earlier discoverers had already discovered and mapped it. So he wasn't going into the unknown. They had known routes to sail, and they knew they were going to find land at a certain place. And he was headed for Hispaniola, what today we would call Haiti and the Caribbean area. He arrived in Santo Domingo, Cuba, and he helped conquer Cuba in 1511. They were able to do that because the Spanish ships had cannon. They could be out on the coast and shoot the cannon, and the native tribes were, just fighting with bow and arrow. So they're no match for the European armament, and they were able to rather quickly conquer Cuba. In 1518, he was given command of an expedition to secure the interior of present-day Mexico, and that took place over 2 years, 1518, 1520, particularly brutal. He was a Spanish explorer and a conquistador of the Aztec Empire. All of mainland Mexico fell through him under the rule of the King of Castile, as a Spanish king. It began the first phase of Spanish colonization of the Americas, and he was appointed governor of Mexico, then titled New Spain of the Open Sea, what today we would call Mexico. And these are two paintings depicting Cortez first as a young man, and then later in his, I won't really say old man, but older age. Next one is Vasco de Balboa, Vasco Núñez de Balboa. He was born around 1475, lived to 1519. We don't have a firm birth date, but we do have a firm death date because he was killed. Balboa was a Spanish explorer, a governor of the territory he conquered, and the conquistador. And again, like the others, he was a maritime explorer for the Crown of Castile, that portion of Spain, Castilian Spain. He crossed the Isthmus of Panama to the Pacific Ocean in 1513, first European to have led an expedition across the isthmus. And his route and the mapping of it was really instrumental in the United States choosing the route they did to build the Panama Canal, incidentally. So he traveled to the New World in 1500. He settled on the island of Hispaniola, what today we would call Haiti. And then he founded the settlement that became present-day Colombia in 1510, which he called Santa Maria la Antigua del Darien. And he became the governor of Veragua. Yeah, basically all of the Panama area. And to a certain extent, Panama. So he was the first to lead an expedition that crossed the isthmus, and found a route to the South Sea. And he was searching for some gold-rich islands that they heard of from natives, etc. Virtually all of the conquistadors were in search of gold. That was their entire motivation, really. They wanted to become wealthy men, and the fastest route to becoming extremely wealthy was to acquire gold. So the Isla or Island Rica, rich island, which is today the Isle del Rey, was named really a group of islands that he called the Archipelago of de las Perlas. And he was conquering the route to the South Sea between 1513 and 1514. So he's going overland with a couple hundred soldiers or troops. But his ability to conquer the tribes really comes from getting alliances with some of the tribes against other bigger tribes. And of course, their weaponry was so superior to the South American tribes' weaponry that they were able to quickly conquer them. Some initially, incidentally, the native tribes had never seen horses, and the Europeans came with these early explorers with horses on board the ship, and they got on land, and they mounted their horses when they were leading their expedition. And literally, some of the initial tribal things were thought that perhaps these persons sitting on the horse, that the horse and man were kind of all one. It took them a little while to realize they're just men, ordinary men, who were riding on horses. In 1519, a rivalry broke out between Balboa and Pedro Bartol and Bizarro. And that led to the arrest of Balboa and his execution by decapitation in 1519. So January 1519, he was executed, really by other Spanish rivals. Hernando de Soto, 1496 to 1542, he was another Spanish explorer or conquistador. He led a North American expedition, what would be today Mexico. He explored with the first governor of Panama, Pedro de Villa, who I just made reference to, in the conquest of Central America. And then he moves on up into what is today Mexico. Francisco Pizarro, 1471 to 1541, excuse me. He was born in Trujillo, Spain. He was a distant cousin of Cortez, the other famous explorer and conquistador. He sailed to the New World in 1509. In 1513, he was on Balboa's expedition to the Pacific. It was led by Balboa, but he was one of his chief lieutenants. He became or was appointed mayor of Panama City, which he ruled over from 1519 to 1523. Why 1519? That's Balboa was killed by then, decapitated or assassinated. So he became a political appointee. He led 3 expeditions from Panama to Peru, 1524, 1526, and 1532. As a result of those 3 expeditions, he basically conquered all of what is present-day Peru for the Spanish. They did not discover many of the really highland mountaintop cities, however, but everything at a kind of ocean level, sea level. He was governor of New Castile. He named it New Castile, which is today's Lima, Peru. So he's considered the conquistador or conqueror of Peru. He led with far fewer men and faced far larger armies than Cortez did in Cortez's conquest of Mexico. But again, they fall into battles with one another among these explorers, basically over who's going to get access to the most gold and other wealth. And he goes into conflict with Diego Almagro, and in the Battle of Las Salinas, he was captured and executed in 1541. So it didn't pay to lose the battle. Bizarro. Bizarro's this, you see a painting of him. You see his holding a sword up into the air, proclaiming the land he has conquered for the Europeans, basically. And then you see a map that he drew of the expeditions and area to conquer what is present-day Peru. Juan de Garay, 1528 to 1583, the final one of the ones I'm going to be talking about, again, a Spanish conquistador. He was a viceroy of Peru, governor of Asuncion, present-day Paraguay. And he founded really the second, in terms of Europeans, the second founding of what is today the city of Buenos Aires. I recommend several books from which I drew this material. The Ames book, The Globe and Compass, The Age of European Discovery. Notice he demarcates at 1500 to 1700. David Arnold also has a book called The Age of Discovery. He demarcates at 1400 to 1600. I think the Arnold book is a little more accepted as the real critical time period for the Age of Discovery. So Felipe Fernandez Ormesto, Pathfinders, that's a global history of exploration, not just the Americas, but the period of 1400 to 1600, when really the Northwestern Europeans are exploring the rest of the world by ship. And this really is good for exploring into India and the trade routes to the east. Mancall, Travel Narratives from the Age of Discovery. That's an Oxford University Press book, and so a really good book. And much of it is just literally taking from the letters or the writings of people who were doing the discovery. And he translates it, of course, into English. Clements Markham, The Letters of Amerigo Vespucci, also by Cambridge University Press, also a really good book. And then Restal's book, Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest. He really deals with why they were so successful and how much they really depended on forming coalitions with some of the native tribes against other native tribes. You know, divide and conquer idea. They could not have with as few men as they did. They literally had at most a couple hundred European military people, fighters, and often on some of the expeditions, they would be dozens to at most 100 or so. And they conquered tribes having thousands of persons and warriors. But it's partially their armament, but partially the fact that the various tribes of South and Central America were really fighting with one another. So you conquer the Aztecs because the Aztec tribe had subjugated other tribes earlier. And so when the Europeans come along, those tribes joined with the Europeans to overthrow their Aztec rulers. And Spoken's book, World History, is another one I used.